verse 9. All right, I handed them out. This begins what some theologians have said the fourth vision, which is the heavenly Jerusalem. And people who are teachers of the Bible have differed on whether the vision here is introduced in a chronological order subsequent to verses 1 through 8, or whether in retrospect of the millennial situation. Many see the heavenly Jerusalem as a description after the millennium. So you have a difference in opinion on when this fits in. But anyway, let's read verse 9 of 21 and move along. It said, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, that's the bowl judgments, came and said to me, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. So the jasper was more like a diamond and crystal clear. In verse 12, it had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. And on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And a wall great and high, of course, is symbolic of preventing the unworthy from ever entering the city. And of course, the 12 angels are pictures of, an honor guard. So, as I told you last week, that the dimensions that were given earlier in the book of Revelation, heaven is in the Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem is in the form of a cube. So the walls are pretty tall, but these gates, most cities back then, of course, would have, gates, and you'd have three in a row, and of course they might be straight up and down. But in any case, the wall, goes around the city, and of course on each side you have, different sets. And the 12 angels guard these, but the picture that we've already seen earlier is that these gates stay open, which is an indication whosoever will may come. So there's some theological meaning in the shape of the holy city. The gates themselves are made out of pearls. And I mentioned to y'all earlier that pearls, when they're formed, if this represents an oyster, then when that oyster is, taking substance in, it may get some dirt or trash down in here, and it can't get rid of it from, the fluid coming out of the animal or the water. If it gets trapped in here, it becomes an irritant to the oyster itself. So the oyster secretes around that substance, a liquid that hardens, and of course we know that as a pearl. And, something that was irritant, something that was ugly now is covered over and becomes something valuable. So most expositors, and that's people who, look at the scriptures and the figurative meanings, see this as a symbol, of our sin that's been covered by the blood of the Lamb. God no longer sees it. So the gates themselves, by having pearls on them, indicate that those who come into this place have their sins covered by the blood of the Lamb, just like a precious oyster. Just like a precious pearl that an oyster, because of the irritant. Whenever I read that years ago, that just blew me away. I said, isn't that a beautiful picture? The gates are open, and to come into the city. And the walls, of course, as he said, symbolize that, and I've said this before too, heaven is, limited because it does have dimensions, and, we don't know how many souls will be in there, but it's limited by the shape of the city, and of course the walls, keeping people from sneaking in, of course, and you got the angels, and of course the 12 tribes, which represents, Israel, is represented here in the New Jerusalem. And at the foundation, maybe they had the apostles or have their names written down here. And so the whole city itself is a figurative way of looking, of the dwelling place of God's people. Now, like I said a while ago, people are split on this. This representing earth. Some people say, with the 1,000-year millennium that, we studied a few weeks ago, that this city comes down out of heaven and will actually exist in where the old temple was, and will be here, and Christ will reign 1,000 years, and that people can come in and go out, and that, the sacrificial system for people like W.A. Crystal and some others cranks back up, according to them. And yet, I find no biblical basis for it. I think it's more figurative at that point. But there's some people who, who believe that, and I'm not going to argue with them. It's not going to divide my faith with them. It's because there's nothing specific. But they see the New Jerusalem coming to earth, where others they just see it coming down, but just more figurative representation of the dwelling place. Because if you remember, it says in the Bible there's no temple in heaven. There's no need for a temple because God is the temple. And there's no need for, the sun and the moon and the stars and things like that because God is the light. So there's a lot of things missing in heaven. But this is kind of just a rough idea. And some people take it literal and says it comes here. Others take the figurative approach and see it as more representation of where we'll live, with him in the New Jerusalem. Verse 13, there were these 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb, which, we know who the 12 apostles are, minus Judas, of course. So you got that representation. You got up here on the gates, the Old and New Testament represented together. It says 12 gates, and inhabitants of New Jerusalem will be able to travel in and out throughout the earth, if you believe that it comes here, which, in my opinion, that fits in fine with the interpretation. I have no problems with it, but I'm just letting you know there's others who disagree. 12 names of 12 tribes symbolize the inclusion of Israel, which I mentioned. The walls had 12 foundations, and on these 12 foundations were the names of the apostles. So this is an obvious description of the structure of the New Testament church. It has 12 tribes, Old Israel, and of course the New Testament. Ephesians 2:20, Paul says, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. So it's a way of understanding the unity, of God's people. Now, here's the part that I was referring to, and I mentioned it earlier, but this is the actual location of it in verse 15. The dimension of the city. The angel who talked with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates, and its walls. The city was laid out like a square as long as it was wide. He measured the city with the rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length and as wide and high as it is long. So the city is a square in the shape of a cube. It's approximately 1,342 miles, going up, across, back, down here. So it's in the form of a cube. I'm not good at drawing cubes and geometry, but that's roughly the idea. What you laughing at, Bobby? Amen. Well, if you didn't have such a glare on your shirt, I'd be all right. But let me start over, since I got a comedy crowd over here, and I'll start over like this. How about that? Now, y'all better with that? All right. Now, having said that, that's 1,342 miles is what 1,500 stadia are. And, I've always been fascinated with this because it's actually measured and it has dimension. And, when you think about it, the wall itself is 144 cubits thick, which is 216 feet. Some interpret this as its height, but a lot of see it as its thickness. And you got to remember, when this vision was seen by John, people lived in walled cities on earth, and they had gates, on those cities, and Jerusalem had it. And so he's seeing a picture and a visualization of what it's like where God's people are going to spend eternity. Now, I give the Jehovah's Witnesses a hard time because when they come to my door, I say, okay, you tell me only 144,000 are going to get to be in the New Jerusalem. Well, yeah. I said, well, why are you out here knocking on doors? I think I'd keep that secret to myself. So I could be one to 104. Oh, that's already been decided. It's full. I said, so you're not going to get to go there. She said, no, we go on the ground and we soul sleep. And then on the great resurrection, the last resurrection, is when we get awakened. And so I said, well, where are y'all going to live? She said, oh, we'll be in heaven, but we'll be on the outside. We don't get to go in here. I said, well, I sure wouldn't be out knocking on doors telling people that. Huh? They don't have any hope. Have you ever really taught Jehovah's Witnesses? Have you, Mark? Some of their peculiar things that are really scary, and I've got a video. I don't think I have it anymore. I know I don't have it anymore. I got rid of it, but you can get them on YouTube. It shows Jehovah's Witnesses that if you get into the group, you can't get out. And if you come in and your wife or husband doesn't, they encourage you to work toward a divorce if they're not going to come. You have to do door-to-door knocking on doors. Yeah, it's a cult. But since you use that word, Mark, this shocked me when I was taking religion courses. The word cult in the Old English language means religion, or another way, a belief system. So a long time ago in our English language, before it got changed into Western English, people referred to churches as cults. And then as time went along, particularly in Western religion, they began to see this more of a negative, since more religions were being, invented or whatever. This took on a negative use, and of course, religion became a way of describing something that was more standardized or more civilized. So you could basically say, when you see this word culture, that culture is people who have a certain belief. And we're a Christian culture, so though everybody's not a Christian in America from its roots and its foundation in our government, it's based on the culture of Christianity. And so that's the reason why you see a lot of our laws and stuff line up with the Ten Commandments, and why we have, and whether you're a Christian or not, you can't deny. So now when you hear people against culture and culture wars, that's what the left is trying to do, is to remove the idea. That's why they're going after the founding fathers and trying to trash them, because they want to remove from education any knowledge that the people who settled here in the beginning were Christians. And that's what communists do. Communists go in and erase the culture and put their culture back in, their belief system, which they believe in no God. So that's what you see going on, and it makes you wonder, but it's actually happening, and it shows up in the political world. Because in the political realm is where the culture wars are being voted on and people are being selected. And, they keep talking about civil war and all this stuff. I don't see that happening. I really don't. I think that's just words to scare people. But in the American Civil War, it did happen. 15 years before there was a war between the states, the church is divided. Southern Baptists were first. Methodists came behind them. Then some of the Presbyterians, not all of them. Catholics didn't divide. And the issue was, could a person who calls himself a preacher or a missionary be supported by the denomination? Northern Baptists said no. Southern Baptists said bye. Methodists, Southern Methodists, they left. 15 years later, we were pointing a gun at each other and said God was on our side. And trust me, I'm a student of that era, and I have read the sermons and read the biographies of these preachers. Basil Manley right up here in Edgefield, and all of them. But anyway, the point I'm trying to get you to see is the Jehovah's Witnesses, like Mark said, is a cult, and it has a negative use now, but at one time it was used positively. But with time, the language changed. But they believe a lot of strange things. You're not supposed to take any blood or any blood products. They asked me the day before they did my procedure to do a biopsy. I had 3 people ask me, if we have to give you blood. And I said, well, what are y'all going to be doing? You told me you ain't doing much. Well, just in case, we need to know, is there anything in your religion or anything that keeps you from? I said, no. I said, I'm here for you to save my life, not take me out, But she said, we have to ask that question. And they asked 10,000 questions. Do you feel safe at home? Somebody out to harm you? And I told them, see, that lady sitting right over there scares me to death, Do you have a gun at home? I said, no. Huh? No, I know. And I've told them. Yeah. No, I told him, I said, no, I don't have a gun at home. I have several guns at home. Yeah.
When they asked me if you looking when they show up.
Yeah.
They asked me if you contemplated suicide. I said, yeah, about 10 minutes ago.
Yeah. Well, they asked me up in Charlotte when they took my bladder. I was in there 9 hours surgery, and the lady was going through the stuff. Obama was president.
Yeah.
And she said, it was two of them. She was training somebody. She said, are you worried about how you're going to pay for this? And see, at the time, I wasn't on Medicare. And I said, no. Obama said he'd take care of me. And that black lady, she rolled her eyes like that. And I said, I'm not worried about it. Obama would take care of me. That's when Obamacare was, So I have fun. One guy told me the other day I was crazy. I said, yeah, that's why I'm here. Y'all got to try to straighten me out. It says here, the wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. Wall being a jasper, transparent glory, possibly diamonds. The city of pure gold, clear as glass, transparent quality of the city and its worth. Verse 19, the foundations of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second was sapphire, the third chalcedony, and the fourth emerald, the fifth sardox, and the sixth carnelian, and the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase or whatever, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. Now, when you, and I'm not going to go through all the colors and stuff, but so these foundations had those different colors. So I don't know about you, but that's going to be a pretty good looking city there. Crystal clear, streets of gold, and you can see right through it. And I told you this in Luke chapter 16, when the man who, rich man's in hell, or Hades, of course he's on the bad side of Hades, he looks up and he can see Lazarus walking around. So with heaven being crystal clear and the floor crystal, those in hell, part of their torment is they can look right into heaven and see us who have been bought and paid for by the Lamb. That's part of their torment, is to be able to, because he said, could you send Lazarus? So that means he knew who he was. Could you send him to my 5 brothers? But he never asked to get out. He just wanted to keep his brothers from coming there. Probably had a family feud like to have Phils and McCoys. Didn't want to have to bring them down there. 12 gates for 12 pearls, each gate made of a single, not pear, but pearl. The great street of the city was of pure gold like transparent glass. So the picture is one broad street. The foundations are adorned with all types of gems. It is doubtful that any significance is intended by the description of the foundations, beyond the beauty and the majesty of the whole. The precise colors of these stones in some cases is not certain. The general picture here is one of the indescribable beauty. Now, I have, through the years, of course, taken the book of Revelation in seminary and then had many books in my library and stuff. I have come across some authors who take the liberty to try to give meaning to each stone. And I find it kind of odd because there's nothing to base it on but their personal opinion of what each color represented. The biggest picture I think that John is seeing is one of majesty, which is reflected just like a diadem with many jewels in it. The colors, the value of these stones, and I think the significance is this place was bought and paid for by the blood of Jesus Christ. And for humans to be able to see all these things in place here on earth, that would be a picture of majesty and unfathomable beauty. And I think what John is seeing is that heaven is a very beautiful place. Now, I have one person in my 40-something years preaching and teaching, my first church. He stayed tipsy half the time, very bright individual. And I was witnessing to him one night at his house, and his wife warned me when I came in. She said he's already had his evening toddy, so you might hear some things come out of his mouth that, she said, I just thought I'd let you know. I said, well, I'm here to talk with him. Let's see what happens. And as soon as we got started and I started witnessing to him, he said, well, I'm going to tell you straight up, preacher, I really don't want to go to heaven. I said, you prefer going to hell? He said, no, I'm just hoping there's something better.
And I said, what makes you say that? He said, well, I like to hunt, and I'm out here in the woods, and that's why I moved out here, and he said, I like to fish, and I love the outdoors, and I love the trees and the beauty and stuff, and I just don't get living in a city with all these jewels. And so that told me he had read the book of Revelation. And I said, now I thought for myself, I'm a young preacher, how do I answer this? And the Holy Spirit got a hold of me, and I said, well, you're not going to have just that. They said there's a new heaven and a new earth. So everything we got right here that's beautiful, that's God's handiwork, the animals. It says the lion will lay down with the lamb. I said all the beautiful things that God created in the first earth will be present there, just like they were in the Garden of Eden. And he said, well, I never thought about that. And so I started talking with him again about it. He was wanting to chase rabbits. He didn't want to get saved. But anyway, him and his wife ended up in divorce because of his drinking, but that's another story. The 12 gates were made each out of a single pearl. And then, of course, I have already talked about that. And the suffering of Jesus, bought our salvation. Then in verse 22, on your back sheet there, I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. This is in sharp contrast to the Old Testament and the millennial period, where a temple existed for the worship of the Lord. The saints are in immediate presence of the Lord, therefore a temple is not needed. Now, right, we can be, right, and we won't have to worry about him being hidden and having a priest to go back there and talk to him. You're exactly right. Now, here's something that's interesting. And this church fits the mold, but if you look at most churches, and this is church architecture, and a lot of people don't think about it until they, start looking at the church buildings and stuff. But in the book of Genesis, the picture is Adam and Eve are in the garden. And y'all just have to guess which one's female. I'm not going to go there. Well, I can put some hair on it like this. All right, so there. I got nervous drawing that. But they're in the garden, okay? Mark, could you leave the room and let me go on my arm? Charlene, take him out to the restroom. He's disturbing. I get offended when people talk about my artwork. He's not the first, trust me. You have God, you have Adam and Eve, and then, of course, you have we know, gates. Because when they were cast out, a sword, an angel with a flaming sword, kept them from coming back in. Okay? Now, if you look at this order there, when it came to the tabernacle, Moses was given directions for the tabernacle. You had the Holy of Holies, and then, of course, you had all the altars and things out here in this court, outside of this. Of course, you had the walls, and it was, this is the tabernacle. And, you had the different things, and you had the gate, and who could come in, and so forth. But in here was where the Ark of the Covenant was. Well, when the new temple came along, it was built on the same order with the same design. And I read a description of what it was like in the Garden of Eden, and there was no walls, there was no restrictions, and like Mark said, we're in the presence of God. But the order is still the same: God, man, and then, of course, entrance and exit. You've heard about the West of Eden? You ever heard that term before? West of Eden? Which is a reference to them being cast out, and when Christ comes back, he comes in the east. But anyway, those were the forms. So our churches today follow the same order. When you come in, people are here. You got the baptistry and stuff here, and though we don't see God being there, we have the same design. And if you go through church history, Christian churches always have that design. And this is just a little bit of information about temples. During the Renaissance period, 13th, 14th, 15th century, somewhere along in the 12th century, in the European churches, the Catholic Church, at that time, they interpret God being so far from man because he's so transcendent, he's above man. So when they built their temples and their tabernacles, they built them with high ceilings and with colorful glass to come in with the sunlight to give people who come in there the feeling that God is so great, God is so awesome. Now, after the Reformation, when the Protestants broke off, Protestants see God with us. Follow me? So they did away with this. They brought the roofs back down, made it a little more simple, took the idols out, the statues and stuff, made it more simple, but they still kept the baptistry here, the congregation here, and of course the entranceway, which follows a pattern. So church architecture pictures through history how people felt about God. And there was a period when the Catholic Church was in control that they saw God so transcendent, and yet the Pope was considered to be equal as Jesus' representative in the church, and he was lifted up, and he, of course, was singled out as being the chief guy. But when the Protestants took back over, that changed, and the ceilings came down, and very seldom do you see a Baptist tabernacle. I don't know of too many. I mean, when I went to Washington, D.C. with our seniors on a trip, we went to the Washington Cathedral. And I, in my little beanie head at the time, had it I don't know why, but I did, that was a Catholic cathedral. It's Episcopal. So when I went in, I was kind of a little nervous because I had to introduce myself in my church and stuff. And I said something about Catholic. She said, "Oh no, this is Episcopal. You're in safe territory here." And of course, I think I mentioned before, it was a Wednesday service, and they had a chapel underneath the cathedral. We went through there. It's a beautiful building. How many of you have ever been there? It's a beautiful facility. Yeah. But they got people buried in the walls and downstairs. But we went down to somewhere underneath it. We were directly underneath it. But there's a chapel. They have several chapels. And in this chapel, they had a Wednesday prayer meeting. And our group went in there. We looked like homeless people. It was cold. And I looked like a homeless man. I had tennis shoes on, jeans. And, and the priest come back there with his robe and stuff. And he said, "I understand you're a pastor." I said, you going to sacrifice pastors today? And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I want you to help me with the service." I said, "I can't go up there. Look at you and look at me." He said, "Before God, it doesn't matter." So I went up there and said, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do." And he let me read some passages from God's Word. But we were up and down just like the Catholic Church. And they had a little prayer bench, and we was up and down. He'd read something, we'd go down. He'd read something, we'd come back up. But it was an interesting experience. And so I got to actually take a part in a religious service in the Washington Cathedral. Not many people get to do that. But I thought it was a generous offer by him to do that. But anyway, God is our temple, and we don't need anything. Here in the Holy of Holies, the curtain was in front, and even in the temple, and nobody could go back there but the high priest once a year to sprinkle the blood of a perfect lamb to cover the mercy seat. And then he would come back out, place his hand on a goat, and they'd send the goat out in the wilderness. But no one was allowed to go in there but the priest one time a year. And it's coming up in September, Yom Kippur, and it comes up in September, and the Day of Atonement. And that's what he did for the sins of the nation. But see, all that's been done away with. This is no need, because Christ fulfills all of this. He was in the temples, in the symbols, the mercy seat, all of it. And when he was crucified, if you remember, the curtain was tore open from top to bottom. So nobody ripped it from upwards. And that curtain, they say, was about this thick with the two hands. And it was all, one piece of garment sewed together like a quilt. And it took, I think it was 60 feet high, something like maybe 30 feet wide or somewhere like that. And it took hundreds of men to hang it whenever they built the temple. But it stayed up there, and it covered the mercy seat. And the priest going in represented sinful humanity for the nation. But when Jesus was crucified, that was torn open, symbolizing whosoever will may come. And then the writer of Hebrews tells us that our anchor is faith, and it holds behind the veil. So faith is pictured as an anchor, and it's anchored behind the veil, which is a symbol that now that Christ has come to save us, our faith is in him, and not so much in all these things that pointed to him. Our anchor holds within the veil. So our faith is engrounded in Jesus Christ. I just show you all that, the symbolism. and of the temple. Then in verse 23, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and the Lamb is its lamp. You know, Jesus said he's the light of the world. And on that note, I gave y'all some homework last week, and I have 2 star students that did their homework. So students, I call on you now. Oh, excuse me, 3 star students. So would you ladies like to start by giving me, one of you give me 2 of them, the other one give me the 2 of them, and then I'll let, and the
First one is John 6:48, I am the bread of life. And John 8:12, I am the light of the world.
okay, and the next 2?
The door of the sheep.
The door of the sheep. Or it could be gate in the King James, but that's right. Okay. All right, what's the last 3?
Good shepherd.
Huh?
Good shepherd.
No, she had that one.
The resurrection and life.
Okay.
The way, the truth and life.
Mm-hmm.
And the true vine.
Okay.
I don't know how we ever put
Yeah, but you didn't. But that's good. So, but the I am is what I want you to see, because when he gave his name to Moses, Jesus knew his audience were Jews, the leaders. So by him, by referring to himself as I am, he had what is the I am, and he said he was the light of the world. He was, you know, and if you know your Old Testament Bible, Isaiah said, those walking in darkness have seen a great light. So that's who he's referring to. So he's fulfilling the prophets and the law. And of course, the bread of heaven, he pointed back to the wilderness, and he's talking about spiritual bread now. And all those I ams, the Jewish leaders would say, he's blaspheming because he's claiming to be God. That name is referred only for God. And even when they read their Hebrew Bibles, if they came across the Yahweh, they wouldn't even read it. To this day, if you go in a Jewish synagogue and they're reading the Hebrew text, they get to where it says Yahweh or I am. When they get to that, they leave it out and they substitute, and they either say Adonai, most of the time Elohim, which is another name. And they substitute because they didn't want to break the commandment about taking God's name in vain. So they're meticulous about that. And I thought that pretty interesting. So if you're ever in a Jewish tabernacle, or excuse me, a Jewish synagogue, and they're reading scripture, you're not going to know what they're saying anyway. But if you hear Elohim, and you will hear that, most likely it was Yahweh, capital Lord, referring to that. Of course, the sun, the moon, and the light, the light will be there. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. Now, my understanding of heaven is that we're not going to be living in kingdoms nor nations or anything. So this is a reference to what they were like on earth. And when they come into heaven, we're all equal. But who they were on earth and the splendor that they had, all that will be absorbed in heaven, so that we experience that as belonging to God and not to them. But nations is a symbolic way of saying that, you know, the people who belonged in nations here, we're not going to get up there and be Americans. Because we had I know there ain't going to be Democrats there, but if we got up there in political parties, but I said that on Twitter not too long ago, and I got a lot of backlash on that. Some guys said, how do you know that? I said, well, I don't know that. But from what they stand for, I don't find it in the Bible, so that's enough. It says, on no day will its gates ever be shut, for there be no night there. How many of y'all used to leave your houses open? Huh? Well, I mean, might want to go fishing. You know? No, outside of the gate represents being outside of the presence of God. You know, we're going to be with him, and we'll all be with him, see him face to face. But went down to the golf course. You know, you might be playing golf that day. But the glory and honor of the nations would be brought into it. And it says nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. So that's how you get to heaven. And the songwriter says in the Southern Gospel song, there's a new name written down in glory. and it's mine. And, you know, does anybody in here know why your parents named you what they named you? All right, who they named you after?
Her sister gave her a $10 baby crib for me, and she stuck Bertha on me. Her name was Bertha. For a $10 baby crib.
Now, you sound like Johnny Cash upset because he knew a boy named Sue, you know. Charlie?
My daddy's name is Charles, and my real name is Charlene. And my mother's name was Dorette, and my middle name is Yvette.
So they gave derivatives off of it.
And yours was a nurse name, too.
I weighed 2 pounds and 4 ounces, and they asked Mama what you wanted to name the baby. She said, I don't think it's going to live. What would you name it?
Death.
She named me Kenneth Wayne.
He's serious.
I know, that's why I asked, because, you know, when people know, does anybody...
If I ever had a baby boy, I'd name him Kenneth Wayne. Because Mama, she said, I don't think it
is going to live. Well, you got the it right, didn't he, Bobby? Did anybody else have a funny or different? Yes.
My mother told me that I was the only one clean out of the first two were twins.
She had 2 sets of twins? You said she had 2 sets of twins? There was 4 of you?
I had twin sisters born before me.
Okay. So,
4 years later, I was born, and 4 years later, she was born.
okay. And you're, how'd you get your name?
Me?
Yeah.
My granddaddy named me after my 2 grandmothers, Estelle
That's typical.
and Roosevelt.
I was named Gail because my mama wanted to name me Deborah. My daddy said he couldn't say it.
Hey, and she's telling the truth, because whenever the grandkids would come to the house, he'd call them, he'd go through the whole list till he finally got the one it was. And,
My grandson
I was
Deborah.
named my great-grandmother.
okay.
Her name was Richie Boo. She spelled it different. But they were Geechees, they were from Low Country, and I feel like probably it came from Richelieu, which is French,
That's right.
which was a man's name.
And there's some of them down there, I've heard that name down in Low Country, Richelieu.
It was a man's name in French. But I think that's where my great-grandmother got it from.
You probably,
I was the only girl, so they couldn't.
That's why you can fix it.
when I was doing Gail's daddy's grandfather, I went into the Confederate compendium looking for his ancestor in the Civil War. And we found him, and Mr. Bowen knew him as Andrew Jackson Bowen. Well, when I went into what they call the compendium of Confederate soldiers, I mean, you know, the thousands are listed there who served. There must have been, out of the 500,000 or more soldiers, the ones that I was, found under Andrew, there must have been at least 1,000 or more Andrew Jacksons. And so I got this little book that was about name, and they said the Southern people fell in love with Andrew Jackson because he was a populist. He's from saying he kind of, got rid of the Indians that were troubling Georgia and northwestern part of North Carolina, and they liked him. And so a lot of people, when he went out, of course, named their children after him, and they were several Andrew Jackson Bowens. So we had to hunt down the unit and everything else. So a lot of people name after presidents. The most popular name of any of our presidents. Now, this is a little trivia. If you're ever playing Jeopardy and they ask this, you'll get it. The most popular name that people gave to their children after Revolutionary War people, even more than the presidents, was Francis Marion. It's in the thousands. People. Yeah, there's a lot. Now today he's not. I've been to his grave site and places down in the Low Country, but I thought that interesting that he was more popular to people than George Washington or Jefferson or any of these other guys. But God's got a new name for us, and when the trumpet sounds and the voice of the archangel, gives a shout, then when we're called up into heaven, it says we have a new name. And it's found written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And that happened the day you got saved. So it's representing a new creation. You are a new creation in Christ Jesus. You've been reborn, and new babies get names. And God's going to give us a new name. Don't know what it's going to be. Hope it's in English so I can understand it.
Pastor Bobby, when I went to Scotland, Tracy and my family, and the most common names in Scotland back many, many years ago was James, John, and Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
And they, I mean, I guess they were very religious back in then.
Yeah.
Because I had a John Gray in my past, and you wouldn't believe the John Grays that there were in England, I mean, in Scotland. But that was, John and James was a big one.
Well, my two of my nephews, they're both dead now, Matthew and Luke. And then the sister was named Martha, and they chose biblical names.